Daniel walked into the lake while we were loading the car, and none of us had time to stop him. I had my back turned, shoving the last bag into the trunk, when I heard his name said out loud. It was the same voice from the night before. By the time I turned around, he was already at the water's edge, moving like he knew exactly where he was going. We chose the campsite because it was marked unused, and that detail alone was enough to convince us. It sat far from traffic and attention, a small clearing beside a lake several miles from the nearest maintained trail, and it barely showed up on any camping apps. The last reviews were more than 10 years old, and the photos looked faded, as if nobody had bothered to update them. That sense of being overlooked was the appeal, because it felt like a place people had quietly stopped thinking about. 4 of us drove out late on a Friday afternoon, and as we went, the road kept narrowing in stages. Pavement turned into gravel, gravel turned into dirt, and eventually the trees closed in on both sides and blocked out most of the sky. By the time we parked, the sun had already slipped behind the hills. I remember stepping out of the car and noticing the smell right away, because the air felt damp and heavy, with a sharp edge to it, like metal left outside overnight. It felt strange, but nobody commented on it, and we carried on the way people do when something feels off, but still manageable. The clearing looked exactly like it had been described online, with flat ground, a fire ring in the middle, and a picnic table off to one side that had started to rot and sag. The lake sat just beyond the trees, and its surface was completely still. What stood out most to me was how quiet everything was, because there were no birds calling and no insects moving. At the time, it felt like an odd detail, something easy to notice, and then set aside. We set up camp quickly, because the light was fading faster than we expected, and our voices sounded strange in that space, louder than they should have been, as if the sound did not travel the way it normally does. Once the tents were up, we all relaxed a little, and it felt like finishing something important, even though it was just a campsite. When we lit the fire, it struggled at first, and then suddenly flared up, burning brighter than we expected, while sparks rose straight into the air and vanished. Darkness settled in fast, and the lake disappeared into the trees until the fire was the only thing we could really see. We stayed close to the fire, ate, talked, and laughed more than usual. It felt better than sitting there in silence. After a while, Daniel stood and walked toward the trees with a flashlight. He had said earlier that he wanted to see the lake at night. The tree line was close, and people wander off like that all the time at campsites. The beam moved through the dark, rising and dipping with his steps. Then he stopped about 30 feet into the trees. He stayed there, fixed in one place. I called his name, but he didn't answer. The light tilted slightly and then went out. We waited longer than we should have, watching the trees and listening, until Daniel finally stepped back into the clearing. He moved slowly, the flashlight hanging at his side. When we asked what happened, he said he hadn't gone far. He said the light never went out. Nobody argued with him, and we let it go. We were still standing by the fire, talking and laughing about old memories, when something caught my attention. I saw something shift in the clearing. When I looked straight at it, there was nothing. We went to bed uneasy and let the fire die on its own. I stayed awake for a long time listening as the forest slowly began to make noise again. I could hear water brushing the shore and leaves shifting somewhere deeper in the trees. Then I heard it. I was lying there, listening to the fire die down, when a voice said Daniel's name outside. It sounded close enough to feel like it was right next to the tent. It repeated his name every few seconds, like it was waiting for him to answer. I stayed still, staring at the tent wall, counting the time between each time it spoke. When it stopped, the quiet felt tight, like something had paused on purpose. Morning came with a dull, uneasy feeling. The clearing looked smaller than it had the night before. The trees sat closer to the edge of where we'd camped, and the picnic table looked nearer to the fire ring than I remembered. We packed without talking much, each of us moving on our own. No one mentioned the voice from outside the tent the night before. I guess pretending it didn't happen made us all feel better, in a way. When we did speak, it was only to check that everything was accounted for. Daniel looked exhausted. He kept his eyes down and barely said anything at all. Near the lake, I noticed footprints pressed into the soil. They were barefoot and led straight into the water. I stood there longer than I meant to, then turned back toward the others. Nobody looked over. I had seen the same barefoot prints earlier that morning, pressed into the dirt beside the fire pit. They were close enough to the ashes to be impossible to miss. No one had commented on them then either. Daniel kept his attention on the car. We went on packing without saying anything about it. As I was putting the last of my things into the car, I heard the same voice from the night before. It called his name again. He turned toward the lake right away. I grabbed his arm when it said his name again, closer this time. It sounded the same as it had in the dark, steady and familiar. Daniel pulled free and walked toward the water. Ripples spread across the lake before he reached the shore. He stopped at the edge. Then the voice said his name again from behind us. We turned toward the clearing. There was nothing there. When we looked back at the lake, Daniel was gone. For a moment, none of us said anything. Then we started calling his name, all at once, our voices overlapping as we turned back toward the lake. There was no answer. The water was flat and dark, the shoreline empty except for the place where the footprints ended. We shouted for him until our voices broke, waiting for a splash, a hand, any sign he'd gone in on his own. Nothing came back. The lake stayed still. We left everything behind, including the tents, the food, and our packs, and we drove until we reached pavement again. Nobody spoke, and nobody looked back. Later, authorities searched the area and found our gear, and they found footprints around the fire ring that numbered far more than 4, all of them barefoot, and all of them facing inward. Daniel was never found. A few months later, I checked the maps again. The lake was still there. The clearing wasn't. I haven't been camping since then, but sometimes the same smell comes back to me. Damp earth and cold water. I think about that night. I don't picture the lake or the clearing. I hear his name being said once more, steady and patient, as if something out there is still waiting for him to answer. That's usually where the memory stops.